What is austerity? In the Oxford English Dictionary, defines austerity as difficult economic conditions created by government measures to reduce public expenditure. And this chart, which has been produced by my good friend Ganesh Nana, formerly of the Productivity Commission, shows real government consumption as a percentage of GDP. And the chart goes back all the way to 1989. And what you can see is in the forecast from this budget, real government consumption, so the amount of expenditure being delivered inside the economy overall by the government, falls very quickly over the next few years. In fact, it falls to a 40-year low at the end of this forecast period. So whether or not you believe that it's an austerity budget, it's behaving like an austerity budget. Kia ora koutou, a warm welcome to episode 7 of Locked Out with Craig Renney. By day, I'm the Economist and Director of Policy for the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions. But by night, this podcast looks at the numbers in New Zealand and asks the hard questions so that you can too. It's been an incredible few weeks here at Locked Out. With your help, we went from locked out to locked in at the budget. It was your support that made that possible. So once again, thank you. If you like the analysis that's done here and think others would too, recommend us to your friends or even your enemies. Also, give us a recommendation wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps get the word out. Here at Locked Out, we're always really interested in what our viewers and listeners want to know and what numbers are making them say, did the accountants from Family Boost write this? You can be in no doubt if you're thinking it, we are too. So get in touch. I'm on X, Blue Sky, and on Substack. We want to hear how we can help you better understand what's really going on and how you can navigate the numbers being thrown around by politicians and experts alike. On the show today, we want to talk about two things: disability funding and the budget. We'll be talking with disability advocate Nick Ruane about recent changes that the government has announced as part of the budget to help fund the disabled community. Disability and the funding that is needed to make sure people can lead lives of dignity and respect is a sadly underexplored area of Aotearoa. Around 52,000 people receive disability support in New Zealand, but the number that should receive support is probably far higher. At the recent census, 1 in 10 children were identified as having some form of disability, and the rate of disability was 35% for adults aged 65 or over. In 2023 overall, 17% of people in New Zealand were identified as living in a household where there was someone with a disability. That equates to more than 850,000 people in New Zealand, nearly 100,000 of whom were children. It should be one of the most discussed topics in New Zealand, but it rarely gets a nod in the national conversation. Now, in March last year, changes were made to funding for disabled groups. This moved away from the long-held idea that disabled people should have more control over their funding. Some support for the families that then support disabled people were also removed, as things that disabled people could claim for were reduced. This was all done as the cost for disability support in New Zealand was threatening the new government's accounts, and there were tax cuts to pay for. Worst of all, this was all done without any consultation with the sector, something that sadly is becoming a hallmark of this government. Since then, the department responsible for disability services, Whaikaha, has been downgraded. The Enabling Good Lives programme was halted and funding for residential care was frozen. An order was put out stating that there were to be no net increase in the number of people in residential care. Essentially, government-supported residential care has become one in, one out in New Zealand. Now, with this recent budget, $190 million was made available in new funding to support those with disabilities outside of care facilities. The language used in the initiative, though, is very interesting. This initiative provides funding to meet the continued delivery of support to disabled people and their families. This funding will help meet demand and inflationary pressures on disability support services. The key words there are will help. That means it's not fully funded. It hasn't fully met demand or the cost of living. And just this month, New Zealand Doctor magazine produced a report saying Budget 25 fails to address long-standing accessibility barriers and renders disabled communities invisible. Now let's talk to Nick Ruane, a passionate advocate for disabled communities, all about it. Well, today, everyone, I'm joined by Nick Ruane, who's a disability advocate who's working with the disability community across Aotearoa. Now, Nick, you've seen the budget, you've gone through the numbers, but before we get there, what problems were faced by the disability sector before we got into the budget? What were the key challenges facing your area?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. I mean, there were lots of problems, but I mean, I think the main ones that we really want to talk about today are chronic underfunding and unmet need. So I think that's really what we want to talk about today.
So you've had a look at the numbers. There's $240 million of money for the disability sector in the budget, $190 million of core funding in the budget. But what are your thoughts? What do you think about what that really means for the disability sector in New Zealand?
I mean, the numbers sound good on the surface, but when you drill down a little bit further, it's really only the sort of money that will keep the lights on and keep things ticking over. What I mentioned up front around unmet need, there's just so much unmet need out there in the community, and that was highlighted to us in the recent census, the disability survey that came out through that. And when you've just got a staggering amount of unmet need out there in the community, the sort of numbers that came through in the budget are just not going to cut it to serve that unmet need.
So can you give me some examples of what that lack of funding might mean for someone in the disability community or who's currently receiving services, and what that lack of funding will mean for them that's come through the budget?
Sure. Thanks for the question. I mean, that might mean, for example, not being able to put a funding application through for a key piece of equipment that someone might need, that people might be using in their everyday life, a wheelchair, a set of crutches, or those types of equipment that people use for every day. It might mean not being able to put through an application for carer support or for the type of relief that families get when they are supporting their disabled kids, and those are not younger, they could be in any age, just to get some respite. Respite care is a massive part of the support that families have, and those types of payments have been put up in the air, and we just don't know what the funding will be for those payments. So those are the sorts of things that families rely upon, and that the disability community relies upon.
So when you say that, that funding's up in the air, when do you think that the sector will have any certainty about that funding? What do you have any timelines from the government as to how it's proposing to meet need in the disability sector?
Well, all of those decisions are under review at the moment. The review started earlier this year. We don't have any timelines for when those decisions are going to come back. So your guess is as good as mine, Craig. And we live in hope in the sector. We've been waiting for a very long time to have certainty. That's all that families want. They just want to know when they can put those applications in for those really critical supports that allow family members to just live their lives like everyone else. And we just want to have that certainty to be able to live our lives just like everyone else.
So is there anything else about that review, sort of, for viewers or for listeners who may not be familiar, sort of, what's it about? How long it's been going on, sort of, what it might mean for the sector.
Sure. I mean, that review started back last year on March 18, when a decision was made to stop funding flexible supports, which was something that the community took as just a godsend. It was really well received, and then all of a sudden, over a weekend, through a leaked Facebook post, those supports were put on hold. And it really upended many family members' lives, and also many disabled people's lives. And the reason given was that apparently it was going to blow up the finances of whaikaha. And then, as a result of that, there was a review, and that's the review that we're talking about here. And we still haven't heard anything about when that review is going to be released. So we live in hope. We just don't really know what's going to happen. We don't know what the final decisions are going to be. So we just don't know. So
in talking of that department, obviously there have been a range of changes to the Disabled People's Ministry. Was there anything that you saw in the budget that will help give some confidence or some faith back that the Ministry for Disabled People, that there's funding there to make sure that it's able to deliver its core role, and it's able to deliver for disabled communities?
I think what we can say from the budget was that the funding, again, will just keep the lights on. It's funding just to tick things over. I think it's really important to say that ministry was a ministry that the disability community fought really hard to establish, and was really proud when whaikaha was established. There was a lot of people who'd fought for decades to establish that ministry. So there's a lot of people within the community that are really invested in whaikaha and want it to succeed. So the funding this time around is just funding to enable it to continue its work. There's no real growth in the funding. The sort of things that ministry does is incredibly important for upholding the rights of disabled people and enabling the mission of that ministry to grow and to spread the disability rights kaupapa throughout government. So it's a really, really critical ministry. And so the funding that came through was really just to keep the lights on.
I guess one of the big things in the budget for everyone was the removal of the money set aside for pay equity, and the big challenges that will be faced by the removal of essentially $13 billion of money the Crown had popped into its allowances to help pay for pay equity settlements. That will have a really big impact on the disabled community. How would you describe the impact that the removal of that money will make, and what consequences will it have for the disabled community?
Yeah, thank you, Craig. Great question. What I would say about pay equity in terms of its direct impact for disabled people is that many members of the disability community receive supports daily from care and support workers. So there's a really close relationship between our care and support workers and disabled people and their families and whānau. So no disabled person or their family wants to be in a very close relationship with someone, a care and support worker that's not being well paid and is not in a good working relationship. Just because of that close relationship and that really close working relationship, some of those care and support workers will get a disabled person out of bed in the morning. They will do really close, quite intimate things. That they'll toilet, they'll change, they'll do all of those things. So when care and support workers are well supported and paid and have good paying conditions, then disabled people ultimately benefit. So there's another dynamic to this as well. That's the organizations that deliver or that hire the care and support workers. They are in quite a perilous position at the moment as well. So we need to think about both sides of this, and I think that's something that will play out over the next potentially 12 months, and it's something we've got to keep a really close eye on, because if the organisations that are hiring our care and support workers are left in a perilous financial position, that further enables or further weakens the ability for that care and support to be delivered. So yeah, there's a lot of really concerned people out there in the community at the moment.
There's one thing I wanted to really pick up on as part of that pay equity settlement. The Minister of Finance said that any future pay equity settlements that weren't where the employee wasn't directly employed by the Crown would have to pay for pay equity settlements themselves. And that might mean that you have organizations who are working in your sector who, where a pay equity settlement happens, are forced by the Crown's lack of, the government's lack of funding to essentially choose between reducing hours or passing costs on to users of disability services, in your area. What do you think the changes to the settings are likely to mean, for the many, hundreds of non-government organisations who will be working in the disability sector, and how does it threaten the viability of that sector in the future if pay equity settlements are go ahead, and essentially those organisations are requiring their employees to either take a pay equity deal or pass on the costs to the people they fundamentally work for?
Yeah, Craig, I think that's a really serious question, and it's something that is on the minds of some of the very large organizations at the moment. If an organization has to consider the financial viability of the organization, because there's been a very large pay equity bill being shifted onto it by the Crown, then it will make decisions about whether it delivers a service to the disability community, and then ultimately it's the disabled people, it's the families that will end up losing out, because the organizations will make financial decisions in the best interests of themselves, and I think that's ultimately not a position we want to be in, because the services will be restricted, and they will be shut down and stopped and cut back, because very large organizations will make fiscally prudent decisions in order to keep themselves from going into the red. And the other side of that is the small to medium organizations, of which there are many. Those organizations could face going beyond the red, and they could face some very difficult decisions. And I think over the next 12 to 24 months, we could see some of our smaller organizations having to make some very challenging decisions about whether they are even in existence over this very issue. And I think that's very, very challenging. I'm not suggesting it's going to happen. I'm suggesting that these are the decisions that are being talked about. And
now, one of the other key challenges in the budget is at the back of the budget. For those of you who follow along at home, there's a chapter of the Budget, Economic and Fiscal Update, which is called the Specific Fiscal Risks. And that one of the things that does is it highlights the risks that haven't yet occurred, but if they do occur, would really impact the government's books. What at this budget did you note of any of the new specific fiscal risks that would have which, if they occurred, would be of really big importance at this budget?
Yeah, the fiscal risks part of the budget is only for those that really are into this game. Yes, sorry, Craig, but yeah, it's but it does provide some really interesting information, and the one that kind of stuck out to me a little bit was around the Royal Commission on Abuse and Care and the redress system, that suggested that the way that this government was progressing to implement a redress system in the way that they are provided a risk in terms of it changed the calculations that that the Treasury was having to make around the cost of the redress system. That was concerning. That kind of made my radar screen kind of start to ring out, because not only was it potentially going to cost more money, but it's also against the wishes of our survivor community, many of whom are disabled people themselves. So that one there was a little bit concerning, and it made me become quite worried about what's going to happen with that particular recommendation. So yeah, I looked at that and I thought, oh, here we go. We're about to see something happen here.
Yeah, and do you think there's a risk that the government will choose to manage the books over, properly compensating and looking after survivors of abuse in care, and particularly the disabled community abuse in care, in order to make sure that in an election year, its budget doesn't head in the wrong direction?
Well, Craig, I mean, they've already done that with our pay equity for low-paid female workers. So they've got form in this space. So it wouldn't surprise me if this happened, and if we saw the redress system being managed to reduce the fiscal risk.
If I can sort of, as an economist, I'm always sort of accused of professionally depressing an audience. So, what does a better funding mechanism for the disabled sector look like? And what is a better funding mechanism, in this area? Sort of, what would it achieve? Do you have any views on how we could do this better? Because as you quite rightly said, the census showed us this is a growing area of the population of New Zealand with growing needs, but the funding mechanisms, the funding choices haven't evolved over the past, 10, 15 years. So what does a better funding mechanism for disabled communities look like at the next budget?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. As a disability advocate, I'm accused of that fairly regularly myself. But I try not to depress people too often. It occurred to me that we transferred over $1 billion from Whaikaha to the Ministry of Health, and in the Disability Support Service budget transfer. It occurred to me that, why are we doing that? Why are we transferring over $1 billion from Whaikaha, which is our Ministry for Disabled People, to our Ministry of Health? We have a much better way to deliver service to communities, and it's called whānau ora. And it's about communities taking responsibility for delivering service to themselves. Now, within the disability community, we have something called Enabling Good Lives, which is very similar to whānau ora in terms of the way that it delivers service and the values that sit behind it. So for me, I envisage a future where our disability community has much greater choice and control over the way that we deliver service back to ourselves. And that would enable a much greater partnership between our disability organizations and our service organizations around commissioning for service, because the money's there. It's not a question of the money. The money's sitting there, but it's sitting within the government. And so in my mind, we need to get the money much closer to the people, to the communities, to the disabled people, to families. And we need to, so that, in my mind, that's the direction of travel we need to go in, and just get that money much closer to our families and our disabled people, and that would just remove a lot of the bureaucratic problems, a lot of the hoops that our community has to jump through in order to get access to funding, and we can set up systems and processes that we design, that are enabling for our communities.
So, final question, do you think the disabled community is being heard? And if not, is it being heard of this budget? And if not, what's your message for government ahead of the next budget, ahead of an election? What is it you would want to tell them, to make the kind of positive change you'd want to see in Aotearoa?
I've been thinking about this for a little while. I don't think our disability community is being heard. I don't think we've ever really properly been heard. We don't have enough representation right across pretty much any sphere you take a look at, across the media, across local government, central government. We're just not We're just not there. We're just not seen, heard, represented. I mean, the message that I would send out to government is we are, 17, 18% of the population. We matter. We count. We are part of our population, and the government needs to take us seriously. They need to work with us. They need to talk with us. They need to understand our needs. They need to fund us appropriately, and they need to get alongside us, because we are a significant part of the population, and if they funded us appropriately, if they backed us, we would actually be a significant part of our community, and we have a really great story to tell, and at the moment we're just not getting that opportunity.
Nick, thank you so much for your time. I hope we can talk in better times at the next budget, that you've received what you want. I suspect we won't, but I'm looking forward to talking with you again on the podcast, talking about how we're making sure that the needs of the disabled community are being met, and that we can talk at the next budget about making sure that at the next election, that 17-18% of the population are being heard and their needs are being heard by political parties. But for now, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Greg.
It may not have passed you by that last week was budget week. I haven't slept, and my coffee consumption has reached a level best described by my doctor as likely to cause an international incident. But still, we press on. During the election campaign, you might have heard the phrase, "It's time to get the country back on track," uttered once or twice. After 1 year in government, the government put out a document saying that under its management, it was focused on delivering real, tangible results to improve the lives of all New Zealanders. How do you feel that's going? Do you feel back on track yet? Well, let's look at this budget, and let's start with the good news. Good. Now, having got that out of the way, there are some numbers in the budget that might back up your concerns that it's still using Stephen Joyce's calculator. Now, every year under this government, the number of people forecast to be on job seekers is proposed to rise. It's rising this year alone by another 10%. And cumulatively, over the next 3 years, there are 66,000 more people forecast to be on job seekers than just at the last election. And we can see on the chart in front of us how that grows from the blue line at the election, and then it leaps by 30,000 across the period. In particular, in the 2026 year, we see big leaps. So no relief from big increases in job seekers in this year or next year. Now, if you say, well, okay, well, that's job seekers. What about the cost of living? That's what the government was elected to deliver on. Well, the cost of living challenges are really being tackled by National by reducing real increases in wages every year from the last forecast. And again, chart in front of us on the screen, the orange line represents what was proposed to be at the last budget, where we saw essentially increases of 1% in real terms in wages over the next few years. This year, it's fallen to 0.7%. And essentially, that means if you're a full-time median worker on 40 hours a week, you'll be, by the end of that period, $978.40 a year worse off. The tax cut that you got in 2023 has essentially just disappeared. Now, that's wages. Well, what about GDP? Getting the economy back on track, getting the economy growing again. Well, just to be sure that we know the plan is hurting but not working, the Treasury's economic growth forecasts are lower than forecast last year at the budget and lower than forecast at the election. Not just in the next financial year, but every year until June 2028. And the chart on the screen shows how every year that GDP forecast has shrunk. And the cumulative size of the gap between what was being forecast at the election and at this budget is $39.5 billion. Now, for those experts following along at home, that's not nominal dollars. That's after adjustment for inflation, meaning each of those dollars being lost is real. Now, according to Statistics New Zealand, there are 5.33 million residents in New Zealand in March 2025. So that represents $7,413 of lost output over the next 4 years, or essentially $1,835 a year. Once again, your tax cut in 2023 has just disappeared because a smaller economy means lower wages, means less income for the Crown. And that money that you were going to receive, it's been given with one hand, but the economy is taking it away with the other. But, again, perhaps this is just a short-term problem, and the government's made much of its program of new investment. In fact, it put out a tax cut at this budget with $6.6 billion to encourage new business investment. Unfortunately, forecast growth in new business investment falls by 2/3 from 6.1% to just 2.1%. And the government's much lauded claims to be delivering business investment, despite all of that, there's less business investment over the next 3 years than was forecast even at the last budget. 20% less investment growth over the next 3 years. Investment growth slows from just over 14% over the forecast period to a little bit over 10. Now, again, it's not all clouds. As an economist, I'm often accused of, professionally depressing people, but house prices keep rising, and they keep rising at an average rate of 6% a year from June 2025. That's more than twice the rate of wages. New Zealand's housing market, with an economy tacked on, will commence normal service soon, just at the same time as we stop building the very last of the very few Kainga Ora houses. Now, over the next 4 years, probably our biggest issue, housing and urban development, has investment by the government changing by $10,000 less. And as you can see in the chart on the screen, what does that result in? Well, house prices will increase up to the end of 2029 by almost 30% on this forecast cumulatively, whereas wages will grow by 15%. So if you're looking to get your first home, you're going to have to work harder and harder, and we go back to the economy that we had in 2015, where we have a roaring housing market and wage growth is very, very slow. Now, there's lots of talk about whether this is an austerity budget. And regardless of whether you think it is, one of the best things you can often do is just pick up the dictionary and say, what is austerity? And the Oxford English Dictionary defines austerity as difficult economic conditions created by government measures to reduce public expenditure. And this chart, which has been produced by my good friend Ganesh Nana, formerly of the Productivity Commission, shows real government consumption as a percentage of GDP. And the chart goes back all the way to 1989. And what you can see is in the forecast from this budget, real government consumption, so the amount of expenditure being delivered inside the economy overall by the government, falls very quickly over the next few years. In fact, it falls to a 40-year low at the end of this forecast period. So whether or not you believe that it's an austerity budget, it's behaving like an austerity budget. And we probably should ask the question whether or not those forecasts are realistic, because continued decline of consumption of that rate dropping to that 40-year low would see cut after cut after cut to government and to budget services. Now, of course, if you work in agriculture, biosecurities, fishery, food safety, arts, culture, heritage, building and construction, courts, customs, the environment, Māori development, Pacific peoples, social development, or sports and recreation, all you see is cuts at this budget. Each one of those sees overall cuts of between 15 million and 1.5 billion dollar cuts at this budget. And what we can see is, what are those cuts then delivering? So overall savings initiatives are $2.1 billion. And we'll come to this in a minute, but the big source of money for expenditure at this budget is actually pay equity, for which the Crown is taking $2.7 billion a year. Now, the tax changes that are being proposed, that's an expense of $1.7 billion. That's a giveaway to businesses and to other groups. But new spending as $5 billion. Can you remember we talked previously about new spending being promised to be $1.3 billion? Well, all of these new cuts, all of that pay equity money, that's paying for new expenditure at this budget. And where's that money going to? Well, let's have a look at that in some detail, because we're spending some strange decisions here at budget. We're spending $29 million on funding for new ministerial services and ministerial travel budgets. Now, as a former ministerial advisor, I'm slightly conflicted about that, but that's more money than all the new money that's being made to help elderly people with care needs move out of hospital, which is only $24 million. Now, speaking of the elderly, much was made of the proposed rates relief package at this budget. The maximum amount claimable will rise by $15 a year, which is 29 cents a week. I suggest to the lucky recipients that they don't spend it all in one shop. Now, we're also spending, helpfully at this budget, an extra $31.2 million on more military-style academies, known as boot camps, despite all the evidence, including conclusive evidence from government, that they don't work. And if a boot camp doesn't work for you, the government's providing $15 million to support new private schools. Meanwhile, ACE centres, early childhood centres, have to make do with a 2% real terms cut to their budget. And that's because the Family Boost programme was doing so well, wasn't it? All 249 people who so far have been able to claim the maximum amount. Now, for students, they don't miss out either, because the pain is coming for them. There's been a 6% increase in the cost of fees this year, on top of a 6% increase in the cost of fees last year. And the government announced that it was going to hold the threshold for when you start making student loan repayments indefinitely. Meaning every year, as your wages go up or as inflation goes up, the Crown gets more money because the threshold is the same. Now, that nets the government a very tidy $65 million from low-income families and from those who've just exited university and are just starting out in the labour market. Now, really strangely, the money that's held by the government from tenancy bonds, so if you're a tenant, you lodge your bond with the Crown, and the government holds that as an independent party. Now, because of higher interest rates over the past few years and higher forecast interest rates, there's been an extra $180 million that's been generated in interest on those bonds. Now, great. You would think that money would be spent on some tenancy inspections, perhaps some homelessness programs. Nope. The government's just gone, thank you very much. That belongs to us now. Tenants, the Crown thanks you for your generosity during these difficult times. But all of these spending decisions and these strange spending decisions sort of, fall into contrast when we look at pay equity changes that were highlighted just before the budget. There are $12.8 billion of funding essentially stolen from low-income, female-dominated workforces. And there is no other word that I can use here except for stolen. But let me put that number into context, because $12.8 billion might not mean a great deal for people. That's more than $360,000 an hour, every hour, over the next 4 years, taken from those groups. Now, the minister admitted there will be approximately 180,000 people who would see their pay equity deal essentially dissolved, and they have to restart again, or with changing rules, they wouldn't be able to apply for a new pay equity funding. If we take $12.8 billion and divide it by that 180,000, that's $71,000 per worker. These are life-changing sums of money for low-income, female-dominated workforces, for cleaners, for nurses, for librarians, for lab techs, for a range of industries, social workers. For those groups, $71,000 would make not only a material, but a significantly material difference to their quality of life. And that has been taken from them at this budget. And it's solely being done so that the government's accounts can look better. Because the original numbers that the government put together in its original tax plan didn't work in 2023. And as a consequence, working people and working women in particular will be paying the price. Now, these working people will also be giving up $3 billion of KiwiSaver contributions from the Crown. So that money is going in part to pay for a tax cut for businesses, $6.6 billion of funding for what we call accelerated depreciation. Only, it turns out that number is a guess. It could be billions more. It applies to double cab utes as much as it applies to oil rigs, to supermarket buildings, and to IT program builds that might take place overseas. We also see a cut in the proposed digital services tax. That's $500 million of money that was previously going to come to the Crown, but is now going to Google, to Facebook, and to other large digital providers. Now, the Screen Promotion Grant also gets another $500 million so that we can sort of make films in New Zealand. Again, budgets are about choices. We're giving billions away to businesses, and we're asking that money to come from low-income, female-dominated workforces. We're spending billions of dollars more on defense equipment, billions of dollars more on corrections. We're spending the money on things that most New Zealanders will see very little benefit from. That tax cut, that $6.6 billion tax cut for accelerated depreciation, it grows the economy, according to the Treasury's figures, by 0.1% of GDP every year. Essentially, it's imperceptible to background growth. So very large tax giveaways, very large cuts across government spending. And even if you just sort of say, well, okay, we don't really care about all of these things, just give me, core funding. Statutory funding for education rose 1.5%. Inflation is 2.6%. You don't need to be a professor of economics to see that's a cut. According to my colleagues at the Association of Senior Medical Salaried Staffs, or the Senior Doctors Union in New Zealand, the health system needed $2 billion just to stand still this year. It got $1.37 billion in cost of living payments. And that's before all of the new programs that health is being asked to fund that it can't. We're putting money in the wrong place. We're not investing in the things Kiwis care about, and instead we're spending large amounts of money, and we're seeing large direct wealth transfers from working people, KiwiSaver, pay equity, straight into the pockets of big businesses in the hope that we will see growth. I would hope that we had a better plan for growth in New Zealand. Now, fiscal policy and budgets aren't for everyone. You have to be a very special sort of snowflake to get excited by vote books like me. But to me, a budget is a time capsule. It tells us what governments of the day thought were important at the time, where its values lay. When you understand budgets, it's a bit like running your fingers over the braille of where ministers believe change should be delivered. And the message that this budget will be sending New Zealanders, and the message it will be sending into history and into history books, is that this government simply doesn't understand the problems facing New Zealanders. Parents will apparently welcome the opportunity to look after financially their 18 and 19-year-old children, according to the Minister of Finance. And that was her exact words during the budget lockup. Taking away KiwiSaver contributions is an opportunity to save more for low-income workers, according to the budget. The name of the press release that sets out cuts to Best Start payments for more than 60,000 children is called Increased Support for Families. Now we're halfway through this term of office, Mr. Peters notwithstanding. If we were truly back on track, would we feel as justifiably angry? Would there have been protest outside Parliament, as many of us feel today? If we were truly back on track, would we be worried about the thousands of New Zealanders leaving for a life overseas? Would we be as worried about the future that's laid out in these budget documents? Sometimes getting back on track doesn't mean changing the engine. Sometimes getting back on track doesn't mean changing the route. Sometimes getting back on track just might, require us to change the driver instead. Now, thanks so much for joining us all here on Locked Out. We hope you found it in parts maddening and in parts enlightening. If you've enjoyed the show, please give us a review or a recommendation on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you download. Locked Out looks forward to talking more with you next week. Don't work too hard. Goodbye.